It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me to talk, even though it has come quite a way. I'd like to start today by just giving you an overview of the biodiversity-related impacts of light pollution, going through where we are at present and where I think we need to go in the future. So, as everyone knows, pretty much we're in a global biodiversity crisis right now. And in 2002, world leaders agreed to try and achieve a significant reduction in the current rates of biodiversity loss by 2010, which I have to say is quite an ambitious target, with only an 8-year period to do such a huge task. It's not surprising then that that hasn't happened. And as everyone knows, all the recent indices of biodiversity declines are still showing significant reductions in biodiversity. So things like the Wild Bird Index, Water Population Status Index, Red List Index, Living Planet Index, all of which are showing continued significant declines, rapid declines in biodiversity across the globe. And of course, this threatens our own existence through the loss of ecosystem service provision like clean air, water and soil. So what are the drivers of biodiversity loss? And as we talked about a little bit yesterday, obviously human population growth is right up there at the top, quite clearly. And at the moment you can see we're hovering around the 7 billion mark, but it's predicted by 2050 that we'll reach the 10 billion mark. So there's kind of exponential human population growth, which is putting incredible pressure on the environment and all the resources that we need. But what's interesting is when you look at rates of consumption as well as human population growth rates. So at the top left there you can see that map transferred since Industrial Revolution for human population growth. But all of these other small charts also show you different indexes of human consumption, so things like urban population growth, paper consumption, water use, etc. And what's interesting is that when you look at those since Industrial Revolution, the rates of increase in consumption massively outweigh or exceed the rates of increase in population. So it's not just simply the fact that there are more people on the planet, it's what we're doing whilst we're here. So consumption rates are growing faster than population growth. And quite interestingly, one of the indexes there is the rate of McDonald's restaurants, and you can see that's growing the fastest. Perhaps that's a good indicator of what's happening with our environment. There are other drivers of biodiversity loss that are commonly mentioned and are pretty much accepted as key issues are anything relating to resource consumption, so habitat loss, agricultural expansion, invasive alien species, nitrogen pollution, everything related to overexploitation, so hunting and logging, and of course climate change impacts. And over the last 4 years, there's been kind of a gathering of global experts coordinated by Bill Sutherland to try and get a handle on these emerging drivers of potential changes in biodiversity in the future. And what they've done is use horizon scan technique to look at global conservation issues, bringing together a whole wealth of experts. And in the last 3 or 4 years, they've identified a number of predicted sort of future big issues for biodiversity. Things like burning of the Arctic tundra, cultivation of perennial cereals, discharge of pharmaceuticals into the environment, milk consumption and associated greenhouse gas emissions, lithium mining, increased demand for coconut water, which is a bit of a strange one, but that equates to land and habitat loss, and growth of concentrated solar power, which also equates to a lot of habitat loss. But what, out of all of these big gatherings of experts and understanding of predicted future changes, none of them, not once, has mentioned light pollution as a potential driver or an existing driver of biodiversity loss. It just doesn't appear. And that's quite interesting considering when you also look at the papers, it's showing a similar pattern. So here I just did a quick Web of Science search to look at what type of papers are being published about pollution, and then I'm showing you the percentage of papers since 2008 according to pollution type, so air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, light pollution. You can see quite clearly that the majority of the papers published are all about air pollution, followed by water pollution, and then noise and light pollution are pretty much non-existent, with light pollution always showing the lowest. Less than 1% of all papers published are covering this topic. And I find this quite shocking considering that there is a wealth of evidence to say that lighting and artificial light, well, normal light, natural light, has a huge biological relevance for the daily rhythms of life for a whole wealth of organisms. And it's also interesting because it's not like it's a new issue. It's not like just emerged in the last 20 years. Light pollution has been around for hundreds of years, and this is clearly demonstrated by this nice painting by Vincent van Gogh in 1888, which is called the Starry Night over the Rhone. And you can clearly see that the light pollution from the gas lamps is spilling over to the river. So this is over 120 years ago. This issue is not new. And what's shocking is that it's not getting better either. It's actually getting worse. So that's the same scene in 2008, 120 years later. And in fact, you could argue it's got worse. There's change in light colours. But also there are more lamps along the river, and they're still spilling into the water environment. So this issue is not getting any better, and it's been around for a long time. In fact, estimates are showing, published estimates are around 6% increase per year in light pollution globally. And between 92 and 2009, there was around about 39% increase in dimly lit areas across the planet, and a 19% increase in brightly lit areas across the planet. So it's clearly not getting any better. What's also quite concerning is then when you start to look at patterns of light pollution, from satellite images at least, I know it's coarse scale in terms of impact on the ground, and then you correlate that with patterns of geographical spatial distribution of biodiversity across the globe. And what you've got here is the mapping of 34 world biodiversity hotspots, which were identified in 1988 or classified in 1988 as being of critical importance for biodiversity in the globe. They only occupy 2.3% of the world's land surface, but they contain 50% of the world's endemic plant species and 42% of the world's endemic vertebrates. So these areas pretty much are it for biodiversity. They're the most critical areas on the planet. And what's quite worrying is when you start to look at where those areas are and you cross-relate that to areas of high light pollution from our current knowledge of satellite imagery. And you see a lot of these hotspots, for example, North America, are already illuminated. Some aren't so bad but are getting there. Eastern, sort of on the east coast of South America is pretty bad. The worst one, perhaps, Mediterranean basin, very few areas that aren't lit. South Africa, down in the Fynbos, again, large levels of light pollution. Western Ghats, Indo-Burma, and arguably the worst case is Japan, which pretty much doesn't seem to have any dark areas. So when you start to look at these spatial patterns of biodiversity in relation to lighting, it then becomes quite worrying. And the picture doesn't seem to be getting better either, because with increasing urbanisation, then you have increasing lights that come with that. And it's predicted by 2030 to be 60% of the world's urbanisation is going to occur within 50 kilometres of protected areas and also inside these biodiversity hotspots. So it's looking a little bit bleak, I have to say. Having said that, though, on the positive side, the fact that we're here today is a positive thing, so there must be something changing. There is a shift in our understanding and our recognition of the role of lighting in biodiversity. So there's been a number of papers that have been produced over the last 5-10 years, which is increasing the awareness about this issue and is galvanising efforts for research and mitigation. So what do we know? How does lighting affect biodiversity? Well, we know that organisms have circadian clocks, this endogenous system that regulates activity over daily cycles of roughly 24 hours. And there's different periodic light cycles, which can be daily, seasonally, or monthly. And organisms use these light cycles for environmental cues to anticipate changes in temperature or humidity, etc., and also behavioural cues to anticipate or to make changes in reproduction, migration, movement. So we know that lighting is an important cue for organisms, and it causes phase shifts in their behaviour. So what do we know so far? Well, there's been increasing evidence about the impact of lighting on wildlife and biodiversity across a whole suite of taxonomic groups, pretty much every group, some of which you've already heard about. But I'm just going to give you a quick sort of run through some of the key ones. So we do know that lighting impacts behaviour. So, for example, there's evidence for impact on reproduction in songbirds in forests where males sing earlier, which upsets the link between the understanding of male quality in dawn song. Females lay eggs earlier, which leads to a mismatch between the timing of food demand and food availability. In great tits, lit boxes which house tits for breeding, they recorded increased food provisioning, which obviously leads to increased fitness costs under lit conditions. But often these fitness costs aren't very well known, and that is a bit of a research gap in wildlife research and lighting. So we do need to try and make that link between behavioural impacts and then the actual costs for the animal in terms of fitness and survival. Other research conducted by ourselves at Bristol with bats has shown impact on foraging and spatial behaviour. So using bats as a model, we looked at how street lighting can alter patterns of spatial movement and with bats along their commuting routes, and we tested high pressure sodium and also white LED, and found that both light types cause significant reductions in activity along commuting routes, effectively causing spatial avoidance. So bats are forced away from their preferred routes, which could infer fitness costs if they're forced to use suboptimal routes throughout the landscape or other routes aren't available. So there are spatial impacts, and these impacts were species specific. So some species avoided the light, others didn't. So bats of the genus Myotis and lesser horseshoe bats were significantly light shy. Other studies have looked at spatial behaviour and found the opposite. So in Grangemouth Oil Refinery, with the massive light pollution there from all the flares and the oil burning, they found that redshanks increased their foraging activity and benefited from the illuminated environment. They had increased foraging success due to the high light levels, whereas endangered beach mice in Florida had the opposite. So under lit treatments, they had lower giving up densities, so they had reduced foraging efficiency and harvested less seeds. So it's clearly demonstrating that it's not a simple case. There's lots of species-specific responses that can go in either direction. It's not a very easy thing to generalise about. There's also evidence showing impacts on communities and community competition. So classic example, probably the oldest one, is bats and insects, where under lit conditions, moths basically have reduced defence behaviour, which shifts that balance in favour of the predator and causes an altered risk environment for the prey. Also, as we've heard yesterday from Frank, we know that there are size-dependent mortality rates under lit conditions, so larger moths attracted to low wavelengths, which again alters the size distribution of prey species for many of the predators, bats and birds included. And any of these aspects where it alters the abundance of organisms within a community can then lead to cascading effects on biodiversity and ecosystem services like pollination or herbivory. So this also is another area where we're only just starting to try and understand the impact at the community level. We also have some evidence of physiological impacts. So in plants, we know that under lit conditions, it can inhibit cell repair and recovery from ozone damage, for example, in red and subterranean clovers. In hamsters, it suppresses their immune responses, which is a proxy for survival, so you can relate that to fitness. And a recent study looked at primates. It's the only primate study that I'm aware of, which found that under lit treatments, the individuals had increased core body temperatures, which delayed their daily patterns of torpor, which can then affect their seasonal acclimatization, which obviously has fitness costs. So there's a whole range of studies out there that are showing different types of impacts on different types of species. But in summary, what we pretty much know is that lighting can alter the risk environment for prey, can affect the ability of animals to detect and locate prey and resources, can affect their ability to orientate themselves in the landscape, can change community composition through a range of mechanisms like mortality or spatial avoidance, can have physiological impacts through reproduction or cell repair. And these impacts can vary. They can be positive, negative, or neutral, and they can be at the individual species level and vary across species. But they're quite likely to be a function of the intensity and wavelength of the light, as well as the visual sensitivity and behaviour of the organism of study. So I think you're getting the idea that it's clearly not a simple picture. It's quite complicated. So where are we and where are the gaps? So previously, up to now, most of the research has been very much impact focused. And what we really need to do is take that to the next level and start to look at the consequences of those impacts. And we need to look at the consequences for key measures like fitness and survival and genetics long term. Most studies have tended to be short term up to now. And what we need to look at really is more cumulative effects over longer time frames, biological time frames, from seasons to generations. So we need to look at long-term impacts. And most studies have tended to be small scale. That's starting to change, obviously, with the stuff in Holland. There's a lot more larger scale and longer-term projects going on. But what we really need to do is look at these broad biological scales. So scale it up from individuals to populations to ecosystems so that we can then try and tease out any cascading impacts and any functional impacts on ecosystem services, because those are the things that are really going to cause collapses in biodiversity. And of course impact ourselves. It's going to be selfish. But this is where we need to go, but none of it's very easy. So a number of challenges that I'm sure we're all aware of, and a lot of us have discussed yesterday that we have to tackle if we're going to try and reach these aims. One of them is basic lack of research already on ecosystem services. So it's very difficult for us to try and understand how lighting might impact ecosystem services if we don't really have a good handle on how ecosystem services work. So there's still a lack of research in that field anyway, and that's the same really for animal vision. There's still lots of gaps in animal vision, our understanding of how animals perceive the environment and perceive light. And of course, we're dealing with incredibly complex systems. There's a whole range of different aspects to this subject area. There's diverse responses, they can be species specific, they can be interactions, they're cumulative, there's temporal and seasonal variation, there's different behavioral responses, different spectral contents, different visual perceptions. So it's a very complex system which we're trying to understand, which makes it a big challenge for us. Then if you add into the mix the fact that we're dealing with a topic which is technology, which is really fast changing. It's emerging all the time. There's new technologies coming in. There's new trends that are occurring like white light, blue end spectrum lights, LEDs. They're coming in really quickly and being implemented, and that's quite a challenge for us to keep up with that. And then the other aspect is on measuring light. So how do we measure light at night? How do we actually effectively measure it from satellites? Is that really relevant? Not really, because you need to measure it at the level of the animal and its environment that it's exposed to. So what level of light is that individual animal exposed to? There's no point measuring it up here when the animal's a mouse running around in cover down below. There's been some studies that have done that using little light tags and things, so that's a really difficult thing to do. How do we quantify light pollution? How do we make that comparable across studies? And then also you've got all the issues of spatial and temporal scales. Really, we need long-term experiments, but of course they take a long time, and the results from those take a long time to generate. So we need these long-term experiments, but they're not easy to do. They require a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of time and investment. And perhaps the biggest thing, which I think has been clearly demonstrated by the diversity of people here today, is the fact that we need interdisciplinary collaboration. It's such a huge topic, and it taps into a whole range of disciplines, from practitioners, geneticists, conservation biologists, complexity scientists, modelers, and lighting engineers, ecologists. And basically that also makes it a bigger task because we have to get everyone sitting down speaking the same language. So where do we go? Where next? Well, I think really what we need to do is broaden the scope. We need to think big. That's my big challenge for everyone. So we need to take it from your individual study and what you're doing, or your individual project and your individual case study, and think bigger than that and try and link everybody together, broaden the scope of it and link everyone up. We also need to work together. We need to be multidisciplinary. So events like this are obviously a great start to that, but I think we need to continue that. There needs to be some forum where everyone's communicating, like somebody was saying yesterday, that it's all very good that the scientists are publishing in peer-reviewed journals, but if the practitioners can't get access to that information, then it's pretty much useless on the ground. So it's really important that we are multidisciplinary and we have a forum to share information and everyone works together. And also, I think we need to raise awareness of the issue. We need to speak out. Clearly, there's not enough awareness of light pollution and its impact on biodiversity. Hopefully, in the next Horizon scan, it will be on the list. And that's really what I think we should be aiming for. Thanks very much.